Welcome back, legends. Before we start, subscribe and share this video right now. Comment below, where are you watching from? And what time is it? Let's explore Scary World. The Appalachian Trail between Roan Mountain and Carver's Gap is supposed to be one of the most beautiful stretches in Tennessee. Rolling balds, panoramic views, rhododendron tunnels thick enough to block out the sun. That's what brought Daniel there in late September, hoping to clear his head after a brutal work season. He'd planned a 3-day solo through hike, light pack, just enough supplies to make the shelters each night. The first day went exactly as expected. Perfect weather, moderate climbs, the kind of solitude that reminds you why you hike in the first place. He passed maybe 5 other hikers total, all heading the opposite direction. By the time he reached the first shelter around 6 that evening, he had the place entirely to himself. That's when he noticed the footprints. They were in the soft mud just off the trail, about 50 yards before the shelter. Boot prints, size 11 or 12, relatively fresh. Deep impressions like whoever made them was carrying significant weight. Daniel thought nothing of it initially. Plenty of people hike this section. But something nagged at him as he filtered water from the nearby spring. The prints were heading in his direction. Same path he'd taken, and they were alone, no corresponding prints going the other way. He shook it off. Someone probably camped nearby and headed out earlier. He made dinner, hung his bear bag, and settled into his sleeping bag, just as darkness dropped over the mountains like a curtain. The shelter was 3-sided, open to the trail, and the temperature was dropping fast. He could see his breath in the moonlight. Around midnight he woke to the sound of branches snapping. Not the random crack of a cooling forest. These were deliberate, rhythmic step, snap, step, snap. Something moving through the woods parallel to the shelter. Maybe 30 yards out? Daniel lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps continued for what felt like 10 minutes. Maintaining the same distance, never getting closer or farther away. Then they stopped. Silence. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, he packed up faster than he'd ever broken camp before. His plan had been to do a leisurely 12 miles to the next shelter, but now he just wanted to cover ground. He started hiking by 7, pushing a pace that had his lungs burning within the first mile. By noon, he'd covered nearly 9 miles. The trail had climbed into higher elevations, winding through dense spruce forests that blocked out most of the sunlight. He stopped for lunch at a small clearing, the first place he'd felt comfortable enough to actually pause. That's when he saw them again. The boot prints. They were in a muddy section of trail, recent enough that water was still seeping into the depressions. The same size, the same tread pattern he'd noticed the day before. But that wasn't what made his stomach drop. They were in front of him. He hadn't passed anyone all morning. The trail had been completely empty. Yet here were fresh prints, heading in the same direction he was going, like someone had walked this exact section maybe an hour before. Daniel stood there for a long time, trying to logic his way through it. Maybe someone had taken a parallel trail, cut ahead somehow. Maybe he'd been so focused on his pace that he'd blown past another hiker without noticing. But he knew the trail. There were no shortcuts through this section. He kept walking. The afternoon stretched into evening and the forest grew darker. The trail here was a tunnel of rhododendrons, twisted branches, forming a canopy overhead that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet in either direction. Every sound seemed amplified. His own breathing, the scuff of his boots, the creak of his pack. And then, behind him, another set of footsteps. He spun around, nothing. Empty trail disappearing into green shadows. But he'd heard it clearly, the distinct sound of boots on packed dirt. Maybe 10 yards back. "Hello?" he called out. The forest absorbed his voice. No response. He started walking again, faster now. The footsteps resumed behind him, matching his pace exactly. When he sped up, they sped up. When he stopped, they stopped. Never close enough to see who it was, always just beyond the curve of the trail. Daniel broke into a run. The shelter was still 3 miles away, but he didn't care. He ran until his legs shook, until his lungs felt like they'd collapse, until the rhododendrons finally opened up and he could see the wooden structure ahead. He practically fell into the shelter, dropping his pack, gasping for air. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. He could hear them there, just inside the tree line. Not moving, not approaching, just waiting. Daniel grabbed his headlamp and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rhododendrons, the trail, the spaces between trees. Nothing. He kept the light pointed there for 5 minutes. 10, nothing moved. No sound except the wind through the leaves and his own ragged breathing. Eventually, he backed into the shelter and sat against the far wall, headlamp still aimed at the forest. He stayed like that all night, watching the tree line, fighting sleep. Every hour or so, he'd hear a single footstep. Just one. Like something taking a single step closer, then going still again. At dawn, he packed his gear and hiked the remaining 15 miles to the trailhead in 4 hours, barely stopping. When he reached his car, he turned back to look at the trail one final time. There, in the dirt at the trailhead entrance, were the boot prints, fresh, leading out of the forest. But he'd been the only one to emerge from that trail all morning. Daniel drove away and never went back. He still hikes, but never solo and never in Tennessee. Because sometimes when he's on a trail, any trail, he'll hear it behind him, the sound of boots that aren't his own, matching his pace exactly, always just out of sight. In November of 2019, a solo hiker named Catherine attempted a section hike through the southern Appalachians, specifically a 40-mile stretch in North Carolina that crosses some of the range's most remote terrain. She'd hiked this general area before, always in groups, but wanted to challenge herself with a solo trip before winter fully set in. The weather forecast had been clear for the next 4 days. Cold nights, sure, but manageable. She started at the southern terminus on a Wednesday morning, planning to average 10 miles a day and stay at established shelters each night. The trail was in good condition, and she made excellent time that first day. She reached the first shelter-balled knob just before sunset. It was empty, which didn't surprise her. Midweek in November, most hikers had packed it in for the season. She went through her evening routine: water, dinner, bear bag, sleep system. The shelter was solid, well-maintained, with a privy nearby and a reliable spring. She slept fine. Day 2 was harder. The trail climbed aggressively, gaining nearly 3,000 feet over 8 miles. Her knees were screaming by the time she crested the ridge, and she was running behind schedule. According to her map, the next shelter, Laurel Creek, was still 4 miles ahead. She didn't reach it until well after dark. The shelter appeared suddenly in her headlamp beam, set back about 30 yards from the trail. It looked different than she remembered from the trail guide photos. Smaller, maybe. The roof seemed to sag in the middle. But exhaustion has a way of distorting perception, and she was too tired to care. She dropped her pack inside and started her routine. That's when she noticed the smell. Not decay exactly. More like damp earth and something metallic. She checked the corners with her headlamp. No dead animals, no obvious source. Just old wood and accumulated leaves. She convinced herself it was normal mustiness. The shelter had the standard 3 walls and an open front facing the trail. There was a fire ring outside, cold and unused. No other gear, no sign anyone had been here recently. The logbook was in the usual metal container, and she flipped it open to sign in. The last entry was dated April 2012. Catherine stared at that date for a long time. 7 years. 7 years since anyone had signed this log. That seemed wrong. This was a popular section. Even in November, someone should have been through here more recently than 2012. She checked the shelter marker, the wooden sign with the carved name. Laurel Creek Shelter, just like her map indicated. She was in the right place. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe people just stopped signing the logs. Maybe the Trail Association hadn't replaced the book in years. Maybe she was overthinking everything because she was alone and tired. She made dinner, hung her food, and climbed into her sleeping bag around 9. The temperature was already dropping below freezing. She could see her breath in the headlamp beam. That's when she heard the humming. It was distant at first, barely audible over the wind. A woman's voice, tuneless and low, coming from somewhere in the forest behind the shelter. Catherine sat up, listening. The humming continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. "Hello?" she called out. Nothing. She convinced herself it was wind through the trees or her mind playing tricks. She was alone out here. That was the whole point. She turned off her headlamp to save batteries and lay back down. The humming started again, closer now. Definitely a voice? Definitely human. And it was coming from inside the forest, not from the trail. Catherine grabbed her headlamp and pointed it toward the woods behind the shelter. The beam penetrated maybe 40 feet before the trees swallowed it completely. Nothing moved. The humming stopped the instant her light came on. She kept the light aimed at the forest for 10 minutes, silence. When she finally turned it off again, she counted to 60 before the humming resumed. This went on for hours. Every time she turned on her light, silence. Every time she turned it off, the humming would start within a minute or two, always seeming to come from a slightly different direction. Sometimes behind the shelter, sometimes from the left side, once, unmistakably, from the trail in front. Around 2 in the morning, exhaustion won. She fell asleep with her headlamp still on, pointed at the open front of the shelter. She woke at dawn to find the batteries dead. The morning was overcast and bitterly cold. Catherine packed her gear with shaking hands, desperate to get moving. She'd planned to do another 10 miles to the next shelter, but now she just wanted out. She'd push the full 15 miles to the trailhead if she had to. Before leaving, she checked the logbook one more time, flipped through the pages. April 2012 was still the last entry. The final line written by someone named Tom. Weird night. Heard things. Not staying at shelters anymore? She photographed the page with her phone, snapped a picture of the shelter itself, and started hiking. The trail seemed wrong somehow. Overgrown in places, like it wasn't being maintained properly. Blazes were faded, hard to spot. She had to check her GPS several times to make sure she was still heading in the right direction. Around noon, she passed another hiker coming from the opposite direction, the first person she'd seen in 2 days. An older man with a weathered pack and the look of someone who'd been out here for weeks. "How far to Laurel Creek Shelter?" she asked. He looked confused. Laurel Creek? That shelter was condemned and removed in 2011, structural damage. There's nothing there now except the old foundation. Catherine felt her stomach drop. That's not possible. I stayed there last night. It's 4 miles back. The man's expression shifted from confusion to something else. Concern, maybe. Or recognition. There's no shelter 4 miles back, he said carefully. Just old trail. They rerouted this section years ago, he paused. Where exactly did you sleep? She showed him on her map. He studied it, then looked at her GPS track. His face went pale. That's not on the current trail, he said quietly. That's the old route. They closed it after he trailed off. You need to get to the trailhead. Now, don't stop, don't camp again. Just get out. After what? Catherine demanded. The man wouldn't say. He just kept walking faster than seemed necessary, glancing back once before the trail curved, and he disappeared. Catherine made it to the trailhead by 7 that evening, hiking faster than she'd ever moved with a full pack. When she got home, she researched Laurel Creek Shelter. The structure had been demolished in 2011 after a hiker disappeared from it in 2010. The woman's body was found 3 months later, 2 miles from the shelter, off-trail in terrain she had no reason to be in. The autopsy was inconclusive. Exposure, probably. But witnesses reported she'd seemed terrified when she left the shelter that morning, telling another hiker she'd heard someone humming all night. Catherine checked the photo she'd taken of the logbook. Tom's entry from April 2012 was clearly visible, but the shelter had been demolished a year before that date. She zoomed in on the photo of the shelter itself, the one she'd taken at dawn. There, just barely visible in the shadows of the tree line behind the structure, was a figure, blurred, indistinct, but unmistakably human-shaped. And it appeared to be facing the shelter. Catherine never hiked alone again. But sometimes, when she's on familiar trails with friends, she catch herself humming without realizing it. A tuneless, low sound that makes everyone in the group stop walking and ask if she hears something. She always says no. James had been section hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 years, chipping away at it whenever work allowed. By October 2021, he'd completed most of Virginia and was tackling a remote stretch near the North Carolina border, an area known more for its solitude than its scenic value. The trail here wound through thick hardwood forests, with long stretches between water sources and shelters. His plan was simple: start at the Dennis Cove trailhead, hike 12 miles to a designated campsite near Wilbur Lake, spend the night, then push another 15 miles to the next shelter. He'd done longer days, but this section was notoriously rocky, and he wanted to take his time. He started late, around noon, which meant he'd be setting up camp in darkness. Not ideal, but manageable. The trail was well marked, and he'd camped in worse conditions. The hike was uneventful. Long climbs, technical descents, the kind of hiking that keeps your mind focused on foot placement rather than scenery. He passed one other hiker around 3, a young woman heading southbound who mentioned she'd camped at Wilbur Lake the night before. "Site's nice," she said, "but kind of weird." "You'll see." James asked her to elaborate, but she just shrugged and kept walking. Hikers said strange things sometimes. He didn't think much of it. He reached the campsite turnoff just after sunset around 7:30. His headlamp illuminated the small wooden sign, Wilbur Lake Campsite, 0.2 miles. He followed the narrow side trail down a steep embankment, his pack throwing off his balance on the loose rocks. The campsite was larger than he expected. A clearing maybe 40 feet across, with room for several tents. A fire ring sat in the center, surrounded by log benches. The lake itself was about 100 yards farther down a well-worn path, barely visible in the darkness. James dropped his pack and started setting up his tent. That's when he noticed the rocks. They were arranged in a wide circle around the entire clearing, each about the size of a fist, evenly spaced every 2 feet or so. The pattern was too deliberate to be natural. Someone had placed them there intentionally. He counted them while setting up his tent. 47 rocks forming an almost perfect circle around the campsite perimeter. Weird, like the hiker had said, but not threatening. Probably some kind of art project or a scout troop doing trail maintenance. He'd seen stranger things in the backcountry. He finished setting up, filtered water from the lake, and made dinner. The night was quiet, no wind, no animal sounds, just the occasional crack of settling trees. The temperature was dropping fast. He could see frost forming on the ground beyond his tent. Around 9, he climbed into his sleeping bag and tried to sleep. The silence was absolute. No insects, no birds, nothing. Just his own breathing and the rustle of his sleeping bag. He woke suddenly at 11:18 according to his watch. Something had pulled him from sleep, but he couldn't identify what. He lay there listening, trying to isolate any unusual sound. Then he heard it. A soft scraping noise, like stone on stone, coming from outside his tent. James unzipped his tent fly and looked out. His headlamp beam swept across the clearing. Everything looked the same. Fire ring, log benches, the dark wall of trees surrounding the site. Except the rocks. They'd been moved. The circle was tighter now, maybe 5 feet closer to his tent. Still evenly spaced, still forming a perfect ring, but definitely closer than before. James stared at them, trying to convince himself he'd miscounted earlier, misjudged the distance in the dark. But he knew. The circle had contracted. He grabbed his phone to take a photo, but the battery was dead despite being at 40% when he'd gotten into the tent. His backup battery pack was in his food bag, hung from a tree on the far side of the clearing. He considered packing up and hiking out. But the trail was treacherous in darkness, and the nearest shelter was 8 miles away. He'd never make it without risking a serious fall. Instead, he did something that felt ridiculous. Even as he did it, he took his trekking pole and scratched a line in the dirt at the edge of the rock circle, marking exactly where it was. Then he retreated to his tent and sat there, headlamp aimed at the nearest rocks. He watched them for 2 hours. They didn't move. Around 1:30, exhaustion forced his eyes closed. He woke with a start at 2:15, his headlamp batteries now dead as well. Complete darkness. He fumbled for his backup light, a small emergency flashlight, and turned it on. The rocks had moved again. They were now less than 3 feet from his tent, close enough that he could reach out and touch the nearest one. The circle had contracted around him like a noose tightening. His dirt line was clearly visible, and the rocks were definitely inside it. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed his sleeping bag, his water, and his emergency kit, abandoning everything else, and sprinted for the trail. He didn't follow the rocky descent path too dangerous in darkness. Instead, he crashed straight through the forest, using his failing flashlight to barely avoid trees, not caring about the noise or the scratches tearing at his arms. He hit the main trail after maybe 50 yards of bushwhacking and started running north, away from the campsite. He ran until his lungs gave out, then walked fast, constantly looking over his shoulder. He didn't stop until sunrise. By 7 in the morning, he'd covered nearly 6 miles. When he finally felt safe enough to rest, he sat on a fallen log and tried to process what had happened. No rational explanation fit. Rocks don't move themselves. People don't rearrange. Stone circles around occupied, tents in the middle of the night without making sound. He reported it to a trail maintainer he met later that day. The man listened patiently, then told him that Wilbur Lake campsite had a reputation. People reported strange things there, moved objects, unexplained sounds, a general feeling of being watched. The Forest Service had considered closing it several times, but there was never enough evidence to justify it. "How many people have reported the rocks moving?" James asked. The maintainer hesitated. "Everyone who's camped there alone in the last 5 years." 12 people. 13 now, including you? What happens if you stay? Don't know. Nobody has? James went back 3 months later in daylight with 2 friends. They approached the campsite carefully, ready for anything. The clearing was empty. No fire ring, no log benches, and no circle of rocks. Just bare dirt and dead leaves, like nothing had ever been there. But when James checked his GPS track from that October night, it showed him camped exactly where he remembered. And when they searched the surrounding forest, they found his tent, his pack, and all his gear arranged in a perfect circle, 47 items evenly spaced, right where the rocks had been. None of them said a word. They left everything there and hiked out. James still hikes the Appalachian Trail, but he avoids that section. And he never camps alone anymore. Because sometimes when he's setting up his tent at established sites, he'll notice small rocks arranged around the perimeter. Never in a full circle, just 4 or 5 stones evenly spaced, like something practicing, waiting for the next solo hiker who doesn't know any better.